And one of the things I used to do with my socially anxious clients, so they would go into a social situation, often with eyes downcast, by the way, and they would be so intensely concentrating on their own internal sensations that they would fail to make eye contact with anybody they were talking to. And then they would be awkward because they weren't reading the cues they could have read if they would have only looked. And then the conversation would become disjointed. And then they would get anxious and fall into themselves, and then it would just spiral.
I see.
And so one of the things that I taught them to do wasn't to try to calm themselves down, but to try to calm the other person down. So when you go into a social situation, pay more attention to the other person. Like just focus your attention outward. And if the person had any social skill, sometimes I had clients who had no social skills. And so they were anxious socially because they actually didn't know how to behave socially. So then you had to teach them the social skills. But some of them had the skills but wouldn't activate them because they were so neurotically obsessed with their own inadequacy that they failed to attend to the cues that would elicit the proper responses. And all they had to learn to do was watch. And then they would automatically respond because they knew how to have a conversation.
This brings us to some of the practical tools that I think my laboratory has been working on, which is, many people have heard about the utility of mindfulness meditation, which most typically is close your eyes, focus on third eye center of your breathing, bring your awareness to your so-called interoception. Perception can be interoceptive from the skin inward or exteroceptive to the world outward. The data are showing that people who are overly socially anxious, for instance, they are too much in touch with their bodily signals. In fact, they can count their own. Right. They can count their own heartbeats without taking their pulse with their finger, which is is a great indicator of how interoceptively aware you are. Those people would probably be best to avoid inward focusing meditations.
Well, it's hard to say, because there may be a variable there that's relevant. See, the reason that socially anxious people are so interoceptive is it's involuntary. Right? They get gripped by the negative emotion, and then that produces this intense, obsessive interoception. That might not happen if they did it voluntarily.
I see.
Because you're going to activate an entire different system, the one you already talked about. This is why exposure therapy works so well in psychotherapy. Is like, well, I'm afraid of something, and if I go near it, then I'm possessed by negative emotion. Well, that's if you go near it accidentally. I'm going to have you go near it purposefully. And what you're going to find is that to the degree that you do it purposefully, that response will be quelled. And that happens. It's extraordinarily reliable. And it does seem to be, this is why I was wondering about gene expression. So imagine that you have someone who's habitually avoidant. And maybe they're avoidant because when they become possessed by negative emotion, they become hyper aware of their internal state and they feel the panic. And so then they freeze or retreat. And they do that constantly. And then they're in this terrible negative emotional state all the time, because every time they see a stimulus that's associated with retreat, they get gripped by these interoceptive sensations. And so you say to them, well, we're going to reverse that. Instead of you being gripped by that, by fiat, by the command of these underlying systems, you're going to expose yourself to that voluntarily. Now, you could imagine that what you're doing is imposing the dominance of that nucleus reunions on the anxiety-provoking systems. And so I'm wondering, see, if you do that repeatedly with people, not only do they stop being afraid of the things that you're showing them, that you're exposing them to, but they become more likely to approach other things they're afraid of, far more likely. In fact, it doesn't exactly look like people get less afraid at all. It looks like what happens is they learn to get braver, and that generalizes. And so I was wondering, when I was reading your research today, is it the case that if you put someone in chronically and voluntarily into a state where, let's say, the nucleus reunions is activated, that transforms their character at the genetic level so that that's more likely to be the case in the future? So it really retools them all the way down to the DNA.
Yeah. Incredibly important question. It's the question. Again, you're asking the exact questions that we're pursuing now. And here's the answer. There are two modes of changing these responses in the neural circuitry. One lies in so-called neuroplasticity, which is could be strengthening of synapses or just reordering of nerve connections. Could be the addition of new cells. There's a lot of excitement about the addition of new neurons, but really that only reflects a small percentage of changes in the brain of adults. It's actually more the rewiring of existing connections, but the mechanism doesn't matter so much. Something gets rewired such that the response is then different going forward. And indeed that happens. Any system that taps into the dopamine system, and indeed everything we're talking about today does, is highly subject to reward-induced neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
In fact, so much so that some of the best experiments done on this have shown that if you give somebody a drug that transiently increases dopamine, works better if you also transiently increase acetylcholine or something like that as well. But for the next hours, 1 to 4 hours, the neuroplasticity is scaled up, right? It takes many fewer trials or many fewer cognitive behavioral therapy sessions. This has only been done a few times, or many fewer learning sessions to create a permanent shift in the neurology such that.
So does that mean that if you believe when you are at the outset of a task that you're doing something important, so you're approaching a valued goal and you have a lot of anticipation as a consequence of that, does that mean that you put yourself in a neurochemical state that facilitates learning?
Absolutely. Without question.
So if you believe what you're doing is important, if you truly believe that because it's related to an important goal and it's a pathway forward, then that's going to transform into a manifestation of neuroplasticity.
Absolutely. And every time I hear about the sort of, woo statements about, I don't want to offend anyone here, but sure, I'll just say, you hear about the secret or manifesting or intention, all of that is it's capturing a fundamental principle of the way that our neurology works, which is that the prefrontal cortex, as a rule-setting but flexible rule-setting machine that taps into the dopamine system, can absolutely adopt new rules for reward release in the brain. Again, there's basically only one reward system. There's also serotonin system, as you know, but the dopamine system is the major currency of reward. So much so that, for instance, everyone knows that food is rewarding. We anticipate food. We eat a delicious steak or something, and we feel rewarded. However, if you are somebody who can attach thoughts such as fasting is good for me, I'm going to do intermittent fasting, or I'm not going to eat those foods, and therefore I'm going to attach my thinking to the rewards that will come with better health, better aesthetics, etc. The dopamine system responds. It's not just a belief in a narrative. It's a real response. And what actually starts to happen is that people start to enjoy the foods that they are restricting themselves to more. There are actually beautiful data on this from my colleague Ali Crum's laboratory at Stanford, that if you believe a food is nutritious and good for you, it actually has better impact on your physiology. Of course, there are the rules of physiology and nutrition that still apply, right? You can't tell yourself that the garbage is good for you, right? But there's a significant scaling up of the positive response that's associated with dopamine and hormonal cascades, which we can talk about in a moment. In the same way, if one adopts a sort of a Carol Dweckian growth mindset approach, okay, it's not about receiving the reward, that the more strain I feel, the more effort that I'm putting in, the closer I'm getting to my goal, that over time will become a rewarding state such that one will pursue states of reaching.
Yeah, well, it should be also proportional to the magnitude of the goal.
That's right.
Right. And so this is, I think, why people are so obsessed in some sense with the search for fundamental meaning. Because you want to be able to associate. So imagine, this is a good story. So you can imagine two people laying bricks. They're building a gigantic wall. And the one person thinks, oh my God, this wall is going to take 100,000 bricks and I'm laying one at a time and I'm wasting my life away, trivially adding to this gigantic brick wall. And what am I doing? This is absolutely miserable, brick by brick. And the other person thinks, in 300 years, this is going to be a cathedral. And so the person in the second state is doing exactly the same thing at a local level, laying bricks, but each brick is related to a very high goal. And that means the reward that's attendant upon the laying of the brick is proportional to the goal, to the aim of the entire behavioral process. And so it seems to me, so if you're aimless and goalless, and I know you've done some work on goal setting, if you're aimless and goalless, then you can't elicit any positive emotion. And if your goals are fragmented, which is also what happens if you're aimless or your goals lack unity, if your goals are fragmented, then no given behavioral manifestation can elicit any dopaminergic reward because it's not a step forward to anything desirable. And so there's no positive emotion. And so you can't learn. Well, according to your account, I didn't know that. See, I didn't know that when you put yourself in a state of apprehension in relationship to a valued goal, that your neuroplasticity improves and you can learn better. That's very, very cool. So, because I just developed this app for writing called Essay. And one of the things we do is we tell people that when they sit down to write an essay, that's the most important thing you have to do is you have to have a question in mind that you regard finding the answer to as worthwhile. Otherwise, the whole exercise is a lie. So even if you're assigned a topic, you have to find something within the topic that grips you and provides you with the motivation that's appropriate to move forward with the essay, with the attempt. And it is a lie otherwise. You're wasting your words. You're engaging in futile activity. And you're going to write something dull and terrible, and it's going to frustrate you and bore you while you're doing it. And that's because your own nervous system is telling you that you're participating in something that you have no belief in. And so, but if you're gripped by the questions, like, God, I really want to answer this question, it's like, well, you're in a perfect condition to begin to write an intelligible essay because you actually want the answer. And then the writing exercise is going to be gripping because you're grappling with a real mystery. And that's so cool. If doing that also puts you in a state where you're much more likely to learn, which makes sense, right? Because if you're doing something important and you seem to be moving forward, that's a really good time to learn. Neurophysiologically, that would make, or evolutionarily, that would make perfect sense.
Absolutely. The system, the dopaminergic system that we're talking about, anticipation and then action and reward, or in some cases, no reward, right? And the ability to persist toward a goal regardless, is a generalizable system. You had that chapter about, get your room in order, right? Get your belongings in order. This is, I think, very relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty goals, the dopamine system is an incredible system because it is depletable, and yet it's also renewable, and it is self-amplifying. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't know what I'm working toward. I don't have a specific goal or question. By completing even what seem like menial tasks, like making myself a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning up completely, drying the cup and putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is even if you make that seemingly trivial goal the goal, in addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit. It closes the dopaminergic circuit. And when dopamine is released, and it will be, maybe not to the same extent as publishing a novel, but to some extent, dopamine amplifies our ability to think into the future, to make additional plans that are unrelated to what you just did, and it literally increases confidence and energy. Why? Well, for the following reason. We all think about caloric energy, but what most people are never taught, and if I had 10 things I could teach people, one of them would be adrenaline, epinephrine, is neural energy. It's your ability to get up and go. It's the thing that makes you jittery when you're a little nervous, but it's also what allows you to move forward, to go out for a run, to pursue any goal, cognitive or physical, etc. Epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, those are the same thing, is literally manufactured from the molecule dopamine. If you look at the biochemical cascade, dopamine is converted into adrenaline, which is the basis of all energy, all neural energy.
Right.
And so, including thinking. And so if one is not in a place of being able to set their goal on a particular lofty goal, a graduate degree, a book, etc., yet the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop. You literally...
Yeah, well, those are at least micro narratives.
That's right.
Right, so they're not integrated across a long span of time. But they're not nothing. And so one of the things, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, well, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally, is fix something. And I used to tell my clients, this is a very good thing to know. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. It's like, can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? And so I knew that adrenaline was a byproduct or down the biochemical chain from dopamine, but I didn't get the significance of that fully. So basically what you're saying is that if you implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf, and you know that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it, you've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have your coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that. That transforms itself into adrenaline and energizes you.
Which then...
So that's partly the reason that it has an antidepressant effect.
That's right. And then you can lean into another behavior. I mean, some of the more successful classes of antidepressants, again, not for everybody, are the ones of the dopaminergic, adrenalinergic variety, right? Things like bupropion, as opposed to, there's a lot of debate about SSRIs. They tap into a different system. You asked about gene expression changes. There's neuroplasticity, which is on the short scale. Completion of an even trivial task like the putting away of the cup will give you more dopamine, which gives you more adrenaline, which in this analogy of either being back on one's heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass, regardless of where one is starting out, let's say depressed is back on one's heels, it's going to tilt you forward a little bit. And then it's a question of what you do with it. So the cognitive appraisal is critical because, again, with the prefrontal cortex being so critical in establishing which of these loops gets repeated, the cognitive appraisal is critical. I'm somebody who can get things done, even if they're small. Now, if you do the cognitive appraisal,
or you can take another cognitive appraisal there too, which is it's small things are not small.
That's right.
Precisely for the reason that we just described. It's like you might have the cognitive appraisal that doing something local, like cleaning up your room, is small, but it's not obvious at all that that's the case. It's not that trivial to put your immediate surroundings in order. And it can easily be the stepping stone to putting things in order on a broader scale. In fact, it's probably the necessary stepping stone to do that. And so they might seem small, but they're a step ahead, and ahead is a good direction.
Absolutely.
And so they're not as small as you might think. And so you can pat yourself on the back, especially if you're depressed, a little harder than you might otherwise by saying, you say, well, this is trivial, but I did it. It's like, no, if you're moving ahead, tilting yourself forward in your metaphor, that's not small. You just keep doing that, you're going to get out of this paralyzed or retreat mode. And then God only knows what you're going to be able to do.